Memory is not about the past at all. And in fact, when we do remember the past, we're not even replaying the past. We're really imagining how the past could have been. And that's why I say, in fact, that memory is never photographic. It's really more like a painting that we construct every time that we recall the past. We still don't know all the details of human learning and memory. But now I'm going to get into some of our latest understanding of how human memory works and maybe get into a little bit of the context of what that tells us about why we remember in the first place. So, a lot of the work we're doing is really to get not at just the act of remembering, but to get at how we use memory. Because memory is not just a matter of the brain lighting up when we remember the past, but rather how we use the past to understand the present. And so what I'm showing you here is a map of brain activity when people are recalling past events. But what I'm showing you here is a map of brain activity when people are just hearing stories and they're not even being asked to remember information about the past. And here's a map of brain activity when people are imagining events that have never actually happened. And so what this tells us is that a lot of the circuitry for memory is not about the past per se. It's really about understanding the present and imagining and predicting and planning for the future. That is, memory is not about the past at all. And in fact, when we do remember the past, we're not even replaying the past. We're really imagining how the past could have been. And that's why I say, in fact, that memory is never photographic. It's really more like a painting that we construct every time that we recall the past or we try to retrieve the past. We really are kind of imagining the past from the perspective of the present. And when we're in the present, we often are imagining what's happening in the present. And when we are thinking about the future, we're again imagining, but we're not imagining just for the sake of imagining. We're often imagining for the sake of prediction. And I'll show you some evidence to support this idea. A lot of the work that we're doing has focused on a concept called event boundaries. So just to illustrate this point, I'm going to show you a simple comic strip. So some of you might have seen this. I've noticed that right now, Generation Z has no idea what I'm talking about here with this comic strip, so this might surprise many of you. This also might surprise many of you in the UK because this is a scene from American football, so just go with me on this. This is a frame from a comic strip called Peanuts. And so this boy is looking like he's going to kick a football. And so if you're familiar with the sport, it won't be surprising that he's walking backwards to allow himself some room to kick the football. And now he's running to kick the football, which is exactly what you would do. But it might be surprising that she pulls away the football, which leads him to actually fall because he's got all this momentum and he's trying to kick it and he misses it. So this is very surprising. But again, now it's unsurprising that he falls down because he was in the air as he missed the ball. So we can basically divide up that set of frames into two pieces of information. One is the set of frames that has to do with him running towards the football, but then another is what happens after the football is pulled away and he falls. Now, the first time that you see this, it might be surprising that she pulled away the football, but afterwards, it's not surprising anymore, and that's why everything in life becomes routine at some point if you have memory. And in some sense, that's the purpose of memory, is to be able to account for all of these surprises that can occur. If something is utterly predictable, you don't need episodic memory for that. You can use semantic memory for that. And one of the things that we found is when we study memory for fairly predictable events, we can find that the circuitry for episodic memory seems to come into play primarily at the most unpredictable parts of the experience, at these boundaries between the events where our mental context seems to shift because something unpredictable is about to happen. And we call those event boundaries. I'll skip
Hours.
this for the sake of time. But if you show people a movie, for instance, and what I was going to show you is a movie that my former postdoc, Alex Barnett, who's now at McGill University, constructed. He basically showed this movie to a whole series of people who were watching it and just asked them to push a button when one event ended and the next event began. And this is based on work that Jeff Sachs, professor at Washington University, had done. And what he found consistent with Jeff's work is that basically at certain points in time in the movie, which is shown on the x-axis, almost everyone who was watching agreed that there was an end of one event and the beginning of another. And you can see that here as these little peaks in time where almost everyone pushed a button. So here, there's certain points in time where 28 out of 28 people push the button. And if you can get 28 out of 28 people in America to agree on anything, that's a minor miracle, right? And many of these times, at least, over 2/3 of our subjects agreed on these event boundaries. What I'm showing you here is brain activation lined up to these event boundaries. So what you can see is these average brain activations in a completely different group of people who are just watching the same movie lined up beautifully with these event boundaries. And this is an area in the default network. So these areas of the brain that I've been showing you, these areas that are involved in imagining, these areas that are involved in episodic memory, also seem to show these abrupt bursts of activation at event boundaries. And they're not the only ones. We can also see these bursts of activity in the hippocampus. It's as if the whole episodic memory network comes to life at event boundaries. What Alex and others have also found is that activity in the hippocampus seems to be related to the successful formation of memories at these event boundaries. That is, if you have people watch these movies, what he found is the more activity that we see during the event boundary, the more likely it is that people will remember the event that came before the event boundary. Not after, but before. It's almost like as if people have this movie and they have an event playing in their head. And once that surprising part of the scene ends, like if you have a scene change, that's when the hippocampus encodes the information about the event. This is data from Zach Ray again. And what he's showing is data from another study in which they had scanned over 340 people from different age groups. These are data from young people, middle-aged people, and older people. And this is data from the hippocampus. And what you can see is if you look at these event boundaries in movies and you average brain activity in the hippocampus, what you can see is right around the time of an event boundary, the activity in the hippocampus starts to go up and it peaks right around the time of the event boundary. But young people show a higher peak of activity than older people do. Now, if you look at this and you don't worry about age and you just test people on their memory abilities outside of the MRI scanner, what you find is that the brain activity that people have at event boundaries is highly correlated with people's ability to remember information outside of the scanner. It actually correlates dramatically with people's ability outside of the scanner and retain that information across a long delay period. So we're now investigating this in a larger scale study to see if, in fact, the ability of the hippocampus to detect these surprising experiences might, in fact, be a useful marker, a biomarker, so to speak, that we can use to detect preclinical Alzheimer's disease. That is, to detect the changes that could be indicative of risk for Alzheimer's before the pathology actually takes place. Now, you might be saying to yourself, okay, well, this is all fine, but these are all movies. What does this tell us about real life? Well, we have event boundaries that we experience in real life all the time. I ask you to ask yourself, how many times have you entered the kitchen, for instance, and asked yourself, wait, why did I go into the kitchen? This happens to me all the time. I'll walk into the kitchen. I'll forget why I'm there. I'll grab something from the fridge and eat something. And then I'll go back and I'll realize, oh, yeah, I went there to get my cell phone. So the reason this happens is because the change of scenery when we go from one room to another leads us to an experience an event boundary ourselves. We change our mental context because we have a change in our sense of where we are. And in fact, this has been shown in not just in humans, but in rats as well. You can see this when we're talking to people and we have a change in conversation topic, for instance. So somebody is talking about something and then they go digress and then they're like, oh, wait, what were we talking about again? Happens all the time. When you end an activity, for instance, you are doing something like washing the dishes and then you switch to another activity, that's an event boundary. And when we get surprised, that's also an event boundary. And this brings me to the next topic, which is that event boundaries allow us to prepare for the future. And this is a very cool line of work that we're doing. This is actually a collaboration with researcher Yuval Nir, that is a group who leads a group in Israel. And what I'm going to show you here is a film. And this film is actually going to depict something, and I won't even tell you what it is, but I want you to pay close attention to the film, and then I'm going to explain why I'm showing this to you. So humor me and just watch this very short film.
Whoa, 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 whoa. We got a big issue, bro.
Damn.
You want to know what our issue is? You about to get jumped, homie.
All right.
You about to get jumped. You ever been jumped before? Well, you about to get jumped, bro. Ow! Ow!
All right. So these researchers showed movies like this to people. But the interesting part of this experiment was they showed movies like this while they tracked people's eye movements. Now, what's really interesting about tracking people's eye movements is people actually move their eyes about 5 times per second. Our eyes are moving all the time, and our eye movements are not random. Often our eye movements are guided by memory. We're guided by semantic memory because we use our eyes to guide. Our eyes are often guided by our expectations about where things should be based on our expectations about, like, for instance, things like you walk into the kitchen and you expect that there should be things on the kitchen counter. You expect that there should be a refrigerator, for instance. But our eyes are also affected by episodic memory. So, for instance, that was a very surprising experience seeing that dinosaur, the person in the dinosaur suit, jump that guy. But maybe having seen this film, you might be expecting something differently the second time around. And in fact, these researchers looked for a sign like that in people's eye movements.
Whoa, 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 whoa.
And so what's kind of cool is they were able to find this in people's eye movements. So what I'm going to show you next is a measure of people's eye movements. And so in blue is going to be a dot that shows where people were looking when they watched this movie on, or where one person was looking, for instance. This is just representative of a lot of different people they looked at. But this is where one person was looking the first time they saw this video. And the green is where where that person was looking the second time they watched this video. And you can ignore these numbers, but these numbers basically correspond to how far away they were from where that person in the dinosaur suit was going to be jumping out from. And so what you can see is initially both times the person was looking in the center of the screen at these two people. But all of a sudden, the second time around, the person's looking at this empty space where there's absolutely nothing going on. So let's look at that again. What we can see here is the first time around, this person gets a little bored of looking at the center of the screen. And so then they start scanning in this area where there's nothing, and there's never going to be anything. Then they go back to the center. The second time around, the person is going back to the place where they know something's going to happen. And they're waiting and they're following, but they're not looking necessarily where the dinosaur is. They're looking ahead to where this guy's about to get jumped, right? And they're looking ahead to where this dinosaur guy is going to go. By the way, I'm not sure if this actually counts as a dinosaur guy, but I'm going to call it that anyway. So this is a great example of how we're using memory for the purpose of prediction. And we've looked at this, and what we found is that these eye movement-based measures of memory are associated with increased activity in the hippocampus. And other people like Jennifer Ryan at the Rotman Institute have shown that these measures of memory that are based in eye movements are associated with memory even when people are not aware of it. That is, it can be used to guide prediction even when people have no conscious awareness of it. It's driving what we do even when before we're aware of it or even when we're not even thinking about it. So it's really being used to guide what we do for the purposes of the future, not for the purposes of recollecting the past. One of the cool findings in this study is that they found that during sleep, there's this dialogue between the hippocampus and the default network. And there's these little oscillations, these waves in the brain that people can read out. And what they found is that effectively, you can ignore the graph, but if you want to, basically this graph is showing the degree to which people were able to look closer to where that predicted event was going to happen. And what they found was essentially after sleep, people were more likely to be able to look closer to where the predicted event was going to happen. Now, remember, I showed you before, Ebbinghaus had shown that people showed more forgetting over time. But this study was showing that memory-based prediction was actually improving after sleep, which was a remarkable finding. Since I am actually kind of running a little bit slow, I'm going to skip this work. But I'm just going to say that we've done some work on curiosity. And curiosity can be thought of as another way in which the hippocampus is guiding us to explore. That is, that when we have these kinds of surprises in our world, we're actually not just driven to predict, but we're actually driven to seek information. And we've shown this using trivia questions, for instance. And so Matthias Gruber, who was a postdoc in my lab, was using trivia questions to drive people to be curious. And what we found was that curiosity improved people's memory and drove interactions between the hippocampus and areas in the brain that process the neurotransmitter dopamine that actually promote plasticity and promote the drive to seek rewards.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below.
With a free trial, you can enjoy the full talk and thousands more.
Thank you for being part of the conversation.